The drive from my grandmother's small bakery in the heart of Tujunga to the ancient monastery in Nalendra was supposed to be straightforward. A simple delivery, 3 boxes of honey cakes, a bottle of rosewater syrup, and an assortment of candied figs. Easy. I'd made the journey dozens of times before, but this time something felt different. The bakery's warm glow had faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the winding cobblestone roads and thick, overhanging trees that surrounded the village outskirts. It was nearing twilight, the air cool enough that I rolled down my windows. The rich scent of jasmine mingled with the faint hum of my car's engine, but the tranquility didn't ease the gnawing unease in my chest. At first, I told myself it was the shadows playing tricks on me, stretching and shifting with the setting sun. But as I turned onto the old forest road, I caught a glimpse of something unusual, a figure standing beneath the ancient archway that marked the path to the monastery. A man. He was tall and rigid, his silhouette framed against the dim light spilling through the arch. He wore a long, dark coat that almost brushed the ground, and though his features were obscured by the distance, I could feel his gaze on me. My foot instinctively lifted off the gas. He didn't move, not even a twitch, just stood there, watching. Maybe he's a traveler, I murmured, trying to convince myself. Or a monk, maybe. That'd make sense, right? My voice sounded hollow, even to me. I slowed as I approached, unsure whether to stop and ask if he needed help or just drive on. But before I could make a decision, he stepped aside, disappearing into the dense tree line as though he'd been swallowed whole. I told myself not to overthink it. He was probably just passing through. This wasn't the kind of place where things happened, after all. But then, it happened again. Not 5 minutes later, as the path narrowed into the kind of single-lane stretch where you don't dare speed, I saw him, or someone like him, standing in the middle of the road. This time, closer. Too close. His coat looked heavier now, and though his face was shrouded in shadow, the tilt of his head was unmistakably focused on me. I braked hard, the tires crunching against loose gravel. My heart hammered as I stared at him through the windshield, but he didn't flinch. The stillness was suffocating. "Do you need—" My voice broke as he moved, stepping sideways into the brush. No rustling leaves, no sound, just gone, as if he'd never been there. I didn't hesitate this time. My hands tightened around the wheel and I drove on, adrenaline buzzing in my veins. The monastery was only 10 minutes away. I could make it. I just had to focus. But the road felt endless. The trees grew denser, the world darker. My headlights carved tunnels of light through the foliage, but even they seemed dimmer than before. Every shadow on the roadside made my pulse quicken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. When I finally saw the lantern-lit gates of the monastery ahead, relief washed over me like a tide. I parked the car near the stone courtyard, grabbed the delivery boxes, and hurried toward the arched entrance, where Brother Elias, the head monk, usually waited. But tonight, the courtyard was empty. Brother Elias? My voice echoed faintly against the stone walls. The silence stretched thin. The heavy doors were ajar, faint candlelight flickering inside. I stepped closer, peering through the gap when I felt it, that unmistakable weight of being watched. I turned sharply, and there he was again. Not by the trees this time. He stood under one of the courtyard's lanterns, close enough now that I could see his face. It was smooth, unremarkable, but his eyes, dark and fathomless, seemed to pierce straight through me. He tilted his head slightly, as if in recognition. I stumbled backward, the boxes slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. "Who are you? What do you want?" He didn't answer. He didn't move. The wind stirred faintly, lifting the edge of his coat. Behind me, the monastery doors creaked open wider. A warm, steady voice called out, "Child, is everything all right?" I spun to see Brother Elias stepping into the doorway, his lantern casting a soft glow. Relief surged through me. There's a man," I stammered, turning back to point, but the courtyard was empty. Brother Elias frowned, stepping closer and placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Come inside. The road can play tricks on a weary mind." I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't imagining it. But as I glanced back at the gates, The night seemed quieter now, the air still. I followed Brother Elias inside, but the feeling of those dark eyes lingered long after the doors closed behind me. I'd taken the narrow canal route through the outskirts of Akari late that night, hoping to avoid the caravan traffic. My small skiff moved quietly along the water, its motor purring faintly as the darkened waters rippled beneath me. The canals were empty at this hour, the homes along the edges bathed in a faint glow from their lanterns. My task was simple: deliver the sealed package to the eastern dock and return home. Easy money, or so I thought. The trouble started when my skiff's low fuel indicator lit up. I groaned, pulling out my waterway map to locate the nearest refueling station. It wasn't far, just a few bends ahead. I adjusted the tiller, guiding the boat toward a dimly lit pier surrounded by old wooden warehouses. The station was quiet, too quiet. As I docked, I noticed a man leaning against a battered barge a few piers down. He was cloaked in a dark overcoat, his silhouette sharp against the flickering lamplight. He didn't move as I tied up my skiff, but I could feel his eyes on me. I told myself it was nothing. People loitered all the time near the docks. It wasn't unusual. Still, I kept an eye on him as I refueled. Once the tank was full, I climbed back into the skiff and set off again. But I hadn't gone far when I noticed something odd. The man's barge was no longer at the dock. I glanced back and froze. A small, dark vessel followed at a distance, its single lantern barely visible in the haze. I tightened my grip on the tiller, trying to shake the unease building in my chest. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but as I navigated the next bend, the vessel remained behind me. I tried to focus on my task, keeping my eyes on the faint light of the eastern dock in the distance. My fingers itched to open the sealed package lying beside me, but the rules were clear. Don't look inside. Breaking that rule wasn't worth the risk. A sudden jolt broke my concentration. The skiff rocked and a loud hiss came from beneath the stern. I cursed, cutting the engine and grabbing the emergency lantern. Leaning over, I saw the source of the problem. A large tear in the skiff's hull, water trickling in steadily. How had I missed something big enough to cause this? As I worked to patch the hole, the sound of another engine rumbled nearby. My stomach twisted. The dark vessel from before was now just a few meters away, its lantern swaying ominously. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing as a voice called out, "Need a hand?" It was the man from the dock. "No, I'm fine," I shouted back, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. He didn't reply. Instead, he cut his engine, and his vessel floated silently, too close for comfort. Panic surged. I grabbed the package, tucked it into my satchel, and leapt onto the nearest embankment. The cold mud squelched under my boots as I sprinted into the shadowy maze of trees lining the canal. Behind me, I heard the splash of footsteps following. I ducked low behind a fallen log, my breath loud in my ears. The man's footsteps slowed, crunching against the gravel path. "You can't run far," he called, his tone casual, almost amused. "Just give me the package and I'll let you go." My fingers clenched around the satchel strap. The weight of the package was heavier now, as though it held something far more valuable than I'd been led to believe. My employer had said nothing about danger, just a routine delivery. But if this man wanted it so badly, there was more to the story. I waited until his footsteps faded, then crept deeper into the woods, zigzagging to throw him off. When I finally reached a clearing, I spotted another path leading back to the canal. With a bit of luck, I could find another skiff or perhaps flag down a passing boat, but luck wasn't on my side. As I emerged onto the path, I found the man waiting. His overcoat swayed slightly in the breeze, and his eyes gleamed with a cold determination. "I told you, you can't run far." Desperation took over. I hurled the lantern at his feet, the glass shattering and igniting the oil in a sudden burst of flame. He stumbled back, cursing, and I took off again, my lungs burning with effort. In the distance, I heard voices, shouts from the eastern dock. A group of workers unloading crates under the watchful eye of dock guards. I sprinted toward them, waving frantically. "Help! He's after me!" The workers turned as the man emerged from the woods behind me. He froze under their wary gazes, then slowly raised his hands. "Just a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "I thought she was someone else." The guards weren't convinced. They ordered him to leave, and after a tense moment, he backed away, disappearing into the shadows. I handed over the package, my hands still shaking, and the dock supervisor gave me a questioning look. "Rough night?" he asked. "You have no idea," I muttered, forcing a shaky smile. But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whoever that man was, he wouldn't stop until he got what. I leaned against the counter of my family's small apothecary, waiting for the last customer of the evening to pick up their order. The shop, tucked into a quiet corner of the bustling bazaar, smelled of dried herbs and aged wood. My father had been running the place for years, and now it was my turn to take over while he recovered from an illness. It was just past midnight when I finally locked the door and stepped into the empty streets of Arkan. The city usually hummed with life even late into the night, but tonight the bazaar felt abandoned. The lanterns along the cobblestone paths flickered weakly, their light barely cutting through the shadows. I adjusted the satchel on my shoulder and started walking toward the bridge that crossed the central canal. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk, and I usually enjoyed the solitude of these late-night treks. But something felt different tonight. As I approached the bridge, I noticed figures lingering at the edges of the stone railing. 4 or 5 of them, shrouded in long cloaks, their faces obscured. They weren't moving much, just standing there, like statues waiting for something, or someone. My steps slowed instinctively and my pulse quickened. I'd taken this route 100 times, but I'd never encountered anyone at this hour. I told myself to stay calm. This was Arkan, after all, a safe city, or so I thought. With a deep breath, I straightened my posture and kept walking, trying to appear unbothered. As I got closer to the bridge, one of the figures stepped into my path. His cloak shifted slightly, revealing a glint of metal at his hip. "Got a moment?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying an edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm in a hurry," I replied, keeping my tone firm but polite. I stepped to the side, but 2 others closed the gap, blocking my way. My heart hammered as I gripped the strap of my satchel tighter. "Let's not make this difficult," another one said. His face was still hidden, but his intent was clear. "Hand it over." I glanced down at the satchel, realizing too late that they must have been watching me earlier. The apothecary had a reputation for stocking rare and expensive ingredients, things people would pay handsomely for on the black market. They thought I was carrying something valuable. "I don't have anything worth stealing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The lie was weak, and I could tell they didn't believe me. The one closest to me reached for the strap. Without thinking, I spun around and bolted back toward the bazaar. My boots slammed against the cobblestones, echoing in the still night. Behind me, I heard shouts and the heavy thud of footsteps giving chase. I darted into an alley, my lungs burning as I weaved through the maze of narrow paths and stacked crates. The shadows felt alive, pressing in from all sides. My mind raced, replaying the moment I'd seen that glint of metal. They're armed. The thought sent a jolt of fear through me. The alley opened into a small courtyard where the remains of an old fountain sat. I skidded to a halt, scanning for an escape. The only exit was another narrow alley on the far side, but it was too open. I'd be spotted in an instant. Footsteps echoed closer. I ducked behind a pile of crates, crouching low and holding my breath. The satchel pressed against my chest, and I prayed they wouldn't hear the wild thudding of my heart. "Split up," one of them barked. "She couldn't have gone far." I watched as 2 of them passed through the courtyard, their silhouettes blending into the darkness. The others must have taken a different route. I waited, counting the seconds, until the sound of their boots faded. Then, carefully, I crept out from behind the crates, sticking to the shadows. The alley ahead led toward the riverfront. If I could make it to the docks, I might find help, or at least a place to hide. I kept moving, every muscle tense, ears straining for any sign of pursuit. When I reached the docks, the air was thick with the smell of brine and damp wood. Most of the boats were tied up for the night, their masts swaying gently in the breeze. A lone figure stood near one of the larger vessels, a lantern in hand. He turned as I approached, and for a moment I hesitated. But his face was weathered and kind, his expression curious rather than threatening. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I nodded, struggling to catch my breath. "Some men. They're after me." He didn't ask questions. Instead, he gestured toward the boat. "Get in." I didn't think twice. I climbed aboard, and he untied the ropes, pushing the vessel away from the dock. The gentle hum of the engine broke the silence as we drifted out onto the canal. From the safety of the boat, I glanced back at the docks, half expecting to see the cloaked figures emerge from the shadows, but the docks remained still. "You've got sharp instincts," the man said after a while, his eyes fixed on the water ahead. "Not everyone would have made it out of a mess like that." I didn't reply, still clutching the satchel, as if my life depended on it. Maybe it had. By the time we reached the other side of the canal, the fear had started to fade, replaced by a deep exhaustion. The man helped me ashore, gave me a small nod, and disappeared into the night before I could thank him. As I walked the final stretch home, the weight of what had just happened hit me. Archon wasn't as safe as I'd believed, and that satchel, I'd never look at it the same way again. I had always considered the hills surrounding Gildale to be the safest place I'd ever lived. Nestled in a quiet countryside, the town rarely saw crime, and the only disturbances were the occasional late-night foxes rummaging through trash bins. My name is Elias, and as a freelance illustrator, I often worked late into the night. Returning home at odd hours had never bothered me until that night. It was well past midnight when I pulled into the gravel path leading to the row of cottages tucked beneath the hill. The headlights of my car swept across the parking area below, illuminating the neat line of vehicles belonging to the other residents. Everything looked as it should, but then I noticed movement. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I slowed the car, I saw a figure weaving between the parked cars. They were thin, almost gaunt, and dressed in loose, mismatched clothes that didn't suit the cold night. The way they moved, deliberate, hunched, and quick, sent a ripple of unease through me. My first thought was that it was a neighbor retrieving something from their car, but something about the person's erratic movements felt wrong. I parked my car at the far end of the lot, keeping the figure in my peripheral vision. They stopped beside one of the cars and tested the handle, then moved on to the next. My stomach dropped. They weren't retrieving something. They were looking for an unlocked door. This wasn't just someone passing through. This was my home, my safe space, and the thought of someone trespassing made my pulse race. I turned off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of my heartbeat. Gripping my keys tightly, I stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit at my face, but I barely noticed. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sharp in the stillness. The figure froze, their heads snapping in my direction. For a moment we stood there, staring at each other. Then they bolted, darting between the cars and disappearing around the corner of the lot. My instinct screamed at me to let it to go inside and lock the door. But instead, I followed. I rounded the corner cautiously, scanning the dimly lit path that curved around the hill. The figure was nowhere in sight, but the crunch of gravel ahead told me they were close. I picked up my pace, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The path ended at a small clearing surrounded by trees, and there, near the edge, I saw them. They were crouched by a tree, rummaging through what looked like a small sack. When they realized I'd caught up, they stood abruptly, the sack falling to their side. "What do you want?" they demanded, their voice sharp but unsteady. "You're trespassing," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. "This is private property." They laughed, high, nervous, and unnatural. "Just passing through," they muttered, though their darting eyes said otherwise. I glanced at the sack on the ground, noticing items spilling from it. A flashlight, loose change, and a car key. They'd been stealing. My heart pounded as I realized just how dangerous this situation could be. "Leave," I said, taking a step back. "Now." For a moment, it looked like they might argue, but then their shoulders slumped. They picked up the sack, muttered something under their breath, and slunk into the woods. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone, their faint footsteps fading into the night. When I finally returned to my car, my hands were trembling. The parking lot felt different now, less like the safe haven I'd always known, and more like a shadowed trap. I checked the cars as I passed, making sure nothing else had been tampered with. Everything seemed intact, but the unease lingered. Back in my cottage, I locked every door and window, something I'd never thought to do before. Sitting in the quiet of my living room, I replayed the encounter over and over in my mind. What if I hadn't noticed them? What if they'd gotten into one of the cars, or worse, the houses? That night, I didn't sleep, and every time I stepped into that parking lot afterward, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, the memory of that figure haunting the edges of my mind. Gildale wasn't as safe as I'd believed, and I'd learned the hard way that even the quietest places could hide danger. When I first noticed the figure, I was leaning against the counter in the corner shop I'd just inherited from my uncle. The store was quiet, the hum of the refrigerators the only sound in the place. It was late, too late for anyone to be wandering around on the street outside. Yet there they were, moving between parked bicycles and empty vendor stalls, barely a shadow under the street lamp's weak glow. At first, I thought they might be one of the neighborhood kids, maybe a scavenger looking for something to sell. But as I watched, a knot formed in my stomach. Their movements weren't casual, they were precise, deliberate. They crouched low, staying out of sight, their hand testing the locks of the delivery van parked a few meters from my door. I stepped closer to the window, careful not to let the light from inside give me away. My breath fogged the glass as I tried to get a clearer look. The figure moved to the next vehicle, their silhouette sharp against the dim light. It was a man, tall, lanky, with a hood pulled low over his face. He wore a jacket so tattered it barely seemed to hang on him, and when he shifted, the street lamp caught a glimpse of his hands. They were pale, skeletal even, and shook like he couldn't quite control them. I felt a chill creep up my spine. This wasn't the usual mischief I'd come to expect in this part of town. I thought about locking the door and pretending I hadn't seen anything, but something about the way he moved made me pause. This was my uncle's shop, my shop now, and I couldn't let someone threaten the tiny bubble of security I'd built here. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was heavy and solid. Pushing open the door, I stepped onto the cracked pavement, the cool night air rushing against my skin. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing louder than I'd intended. "What are you doing?" The man froze, his back hunched like a cornered animal. Slowly he turned toward me, and as his hood slipped back, I got my first real look at him. His eyes were wide, too wide, the whites a stark contrast against the hollow shadows of his face. His pupils were blown like dark pits, and his gaunt cheeks looked as though they'd collapse under their own weight. He was shivering, his arms twitching at his sides, but it didn't seem to be from the cold. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my grip on the flashlight tightened. He took a step forward, and I instinctively took one back. "Just looking," he rasped, his voice cracked and barely audible. "Just looking for something." "There's nothing for you here," I said firmly, though my pulse thundered in my ears. "You need to leave." His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought he might argue, or worse, come closer. But then, something in his expression shifted, as though he'd just remembered something important. He nodded, his head jerking awkwardly, and turned away, shuffling toward the far end of the street. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as he disappeared into the shadows beyond the last vendor stall. My gut told me this wasn't over. Sure enough, as I turned to go back inside, I caught sight of him again, this time near the market storage shed. He was testing the doors, peering into the windows, the same methodical way he'd moved before. I clenched my teeth and pulled out my phone, dialing the local patrol office. My voice was a shaky whisper as I explained what was happening. "He's not just loitering," I told the officer on the other end. "He's looking for something, or someone. Please just send someone over." They assured me a unit was on its way, but the minutes stretched endlessly. I kept my eyes on the figure, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay hidden. When the patrol car finally pulled up, its blue lights flashing against the walls, the man stopped in his tracks. For a second, I thought he might run, but instead, he simply stood there, his hands limp at his sides. The officers approached him cautiously, speaking in calm, measured tones. He didn't resist when they took his arms and led him toward the car, though his wide eyes darted around as if he were trying to memorize every detail of the street. As they placed him in the back seat, one of the officers glanced at me and gave a small nod. When they drove away, the quiet returned, but it wasn't the same as before. The unease lingered, a shadow stretching into every corner of my mind. That night, as I locked up the shop and made my way upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fragile had cracked in my little world. This place was supposed to be safe, but safety, I realized, is often an illusion. And illusions, once broken, are hard to rebuild.